Well, what happens if something goes wrong? This is the thing, this is why this is so important. What happens if something goes wrong? An indeterminate set of those irrelevant entities has now become relevant. That's the problem, is the invisibility disappears. And so, for example, you're all treating each other in this room right now as ignorable entities, roughly speaking. You could all be blobs from a perceptual perspective. And if you look at how you see the room, except for the person that you're focusing on, everyone else is a blob. And some of them are virtually invisible blobs. And that's fine, because you're adequately represented as a blob unless you do something that disturbs the ongoing flow of goal-directed action. Just like the gorilla thing, right? So the damn gorilla was invisible because it didn't get in the way, even though you'd think, of course, you'd see a gorilla. It's like everything that doesn't get in the way is invisible, except for that small fraction of things that you can use for your purpose. And that's how you perceive. So it's so mind-boggling, that, because it puts perception into the realm of ethics. It isn't what you'd expect. You see what you're aiming at. And you know that. You know that. You're standing on a street corner and you look up. And soon there's 10 advanced chimpanzees like you right beside you looking up to see what the hell it is that you're aiming at. Because they assume, just by watching you, that if you're focusing your perception on something and you're fixated on it, that it's relevant and important. It's tool-like or maybe obstacle-like. It's relevant for some reason. And so we live in a landscape of relevance. And that's to me, that's an absolutely mind-boggling idea, because that is way different than living in a landscape of facts. It is not the same thing, even a little bit. And there are philosophers who've pursued that idea quite, well, I would say to quite an incredible degree. Heidegger is probably the one who's done that more than anyone else. But the 19th century pragmatists were very interested in that as well. But because the classic scientific idea is something like, you perceive a universe of facts and derive conclusions and act. It's like, no, you don't. You perceive a landscape of pre-categorized relevance that's dependent on your ethic. Jesus, it's so peculiar, that. And so that brings up real questions like, what ethic best structures your perceptions? Well, that is the interesting idea as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so then we can make this a little bit more interesting, I think is the right way of thinking about it. Okay, well, so you've got tools and obstacles, but they're not dead. That's the other thing. Because we're in an ethical landscape, because we're in a motivated landscape, whether something is a tool or an obstacle actually matters to you. And we can actually define matter. Matter's a weird word, because there's matter, and then there's the things that matter. And you could say the world is made out of matter, or you could say that the world is made out of things that matter. And I would say you act like the world is made out of things that matter. You might say, I don't believe that, I believe it's made out of matter. But no, you don't, because that's not how you act. It might be what you say you do, but it is not what you do. So why do things matter? Well, first of all, irrelevant things don't matter. And thank God for that. So you want most things to be irrelevant. Now that's kind of dull, and it takes the glory and the glamour out of the world. But from a cognitive perspective, it's definitely an advantage. So irrelevancy, man, that's critical. And a huge amount of what you have done is learned irrelevance. It's the basis of your cognitive knowledge, is learned irrelevance. What to ignore. Okay, fine, so that zeroes things out. You turn most of the world into zero. Well, then you have this small subset of things that are beneficial to you, that you can use for the purposes of your current operation, which we'll define in more detail. You can use that for the purposes of your current endeavor. And then you have obstacles. And so, for example, if I'm late for class, so I'm in a particular state of mind, and I walk in here and I see that, I'm going to get a little burst of negative emotion. It's irritation. And the reason for that is not a recycling bin then. It's an obstacle that some dimwit left there just to annoy me. And I mean, you know what I mean. That's how you react to the world in a situation like that. It's like, it's not a recycling bin. If it's here, and I don't want to stand there, then it's a recycling bin. If it's there, it's an obstacle. And as soon as I look at it, it isn't that I see it and then get annoyed. It's that annoyance is part of the perception. Because it's an obstacle in my pathway, the emotion comes along with the perception. It's not laden on top of it. It's not, oh, I don't think that's a recycling bin, that's in the wrong place, now it's in my way, I should be annoyed. That isn't what happens, is the annoyance. My suspicions are that the damn annoyance is faster than the object perception, because it's a more primordial circuit. So you actually, now there's a great book if you're interested in this sort of thing. There's a great book called An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, which was written by a guy named Gibson back in the 70s, and it's brilliant. His fundamental conclusion is, I think, wrong, but it doesn't matter. The book is not only brilliant because, see, he was the guy that came up with the idea of affordance. And an affordance is something that affords some utility, and that can be positive or negative. And he thought about the world as being full of furniture, roughly speaking, something like that. And that what you saw, what you perceived directly was the affordance. And so imagine the visual cliff experiment. So let's say I put a piece of glass over top of the space between these two tables, no chair there. And I take a duck, and I put the duck here, and the duck walks out on the glass. The duck doesn't care. It'll just walk out on the glass. Well, it's an aquatic animal, and so if there's depth underneath it, it doesn't really bother a duck. But if you put a human infant on there, old enough to crawl, the human infant will look over and it's not going on that glass. And you might say, well, what does it see? And you could say it sees a space between the two tables and infers that it might fall, but it's like 8 months old. Like, what the hell? It's inferring that? No, it's not. It sees a place to fall off of. And that's Gibson's fundamental point, is that you don't see a cliff, you see a falling off place. And of course, why wouldn't you see that? Because if that isn't what you saw, you wouldn't be here, because one of your dopey ancestors would have wandered off the cliff and died. The ones that saw a falling off place, they just stayed away from that. And you know, if you have vertigo, and even if you don't, if you're up on the 35th floor of an apartment building and you walk out onto the balcony, it's really interesting to notice your perception, because you might think, well, you see the space and you become afraid. It's like, no, you don't. You walk closer to it and your body, you perceive the damn thing with your body. You can also see it, but you perceive it with your body. It's like, don't go there. Don't go any closer. And you're there's an automatic mapping of that place onto do this, go away from there. And that's underneath and faster than the actual, quote, conscious object perception. So anyways, the other thing about Gibson's book that I love is he is so clear, that guy. He's such a good writer, because he takes you through a very complex argument, but it's just a pristine example of reasoning. The whole book is reasoning. It's brilliant, brilliant. So anyway, so if you want some background on that idea, the idea of perception of utility, let's say, that's a great place to look. But it's also worth thinking about it from a biological perspective, because bloody well, of course you're going to see the world as what matters, because you're the sort of creature that cares about what matters, mostly because you don't want to die. So you can't remove the fact that you don't want to die from your perceptions. Well, if you did, well, you can imagine what would happen if you did. You know, you do something like wander off a falling off place and that would be the end of you. So it's built into your damn perceptions. And so it's built into the facts that you see because there's an infinite number of facts. And so even just selecting the facts, that's an ethical issue. So this actually matters practically too, because one of the things that I've come to understand about political arguments is, well, people say, well, the person on the other side of the ideological continuum has different opinions than I do. It's like, no, they don't. Or maybe they do. But they don't see the same facts. Because the filter they use to select from among the infinite number of available facts preferentially presents them with the facts that are relevant to them. And that's already built into their ethic. And so one of the horrible things about political discussions is that you're actually having a discussion about what the facts are. And you say, well, the facts are the same for everyone. It's like, yeah. It's like saying, I have an infinite library of books. And you can come into it. It's like, well, you're going to pick out the same book? It seems highly improbable. And that's the problem with facts. It's like, there's a lot of them. You know, you try. to do something like untangle the Israel-Palestine conflict. I mean, one of the things you just to start with is like, okay, how far back are you going to go? Well, I would say it depends on what argument you want to make. You know, if you want to make argument A, you go back 100 years. If you want to make argument B, you go back 3,000 years. And then you could have an argument about which time scale you should use, but it's not like it's obvious. You know, is it 10 years? Is it 1 year? Is it 6 months? Like, it's not 3,000 years. Is it 2,999 years? Like, where are the borders of relevancy when you're laying out the landscape of the argument? God only knows. It's intractable. And you know, partly the way your temperament solves that problem, because it does, is say, well, a creature like you with your temperament preferentially attends to this set of facts. And that'll work, because attending to that sort of facts is likely to produce a reasonable outcome for you in most circumstances. And it's a way that you simplify the world and make a tremendous amount of it irrelevant. A priori filters.